The ceiling wasn't mine. That was the first coherent thought I managed, somewhere between consciousness and the kind of headache that makes you genuinely wonder if your skull has been replaced overnight with something smaller. I stared up at recessed lighting I didn't recognize, set into a plaster ceiling that was too high, too white, too perfect to be the water-stained one above my bed in Wicker Park. The sheets were wrong too. Egyptian cotton, maybe, or something even more obscene. Cool and heavy in a way that made my own bedding feel like I'd been sleeping inside a paper bag all my life. I didn't move. I wasn't sure I could. My body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled by someone working without instructions, every joint stiff, every muscle registering a complaint. The taste in my mouth was champagne gone sour and something else. A shot of something dark and expensive that I distinctly remembered thinking was a terrible idea at the time. When exactly was that? I forced my eyes to track sideways, cataloging the room the way my aunt used to tell me to catalog a scene, slowly, without assuming anything, floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline on the other side of them, Lake Michigan catching the early light, minimalist furniture in charcoal and bone, a single orchid on the nightstand in a ceramic pot that probably cost more than my monthly student loan payment. I was wearing a white button-down shirt that reached my mid-thigh. It was not mine. My dress, the emerald green one I'd borrowed from my roommate Bess for the gallery opening, was nowhere in this room. I sat up too fast. The room tilted. Easy. The voice came from across the room and I spun toward it badly enough that I had to grab the edge of the mattress. A man sat in the chair by the window, one ankle crossed over his knee, a coffee cup in his hand, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not amusement. Not concern. Something more measured than either. He was. I registered this in the detached way you notice things when your brain is still booting up. Extraordinarily good-looking in the kind of way that made you slightly suspicious of him. Dark hair, a jaw that could have been engineered for the purpose. He'd clearly already showered and changed. He wore a charcoal Henley and slacks, and he looked like he'd been awake for hours, comfortable and settled in the room the way you're only comfortable in a space that belongs to you. "You're in my apartment," he said. Not unkindly. "I need to leave," I said. "You do," he agreed, "though you might want shoes first. And possibly water." I looked down at the end of the bed. My heels were placed neatly beside it, side by side, like someone had taken the time to net them there carefully. My bag was on the nightstand. My phone was on top of it, fully charged. None of that helped me understand how I'd gotten here. "I don't," I started. "Remember," he said. "I know." He stood and set his coffee down, crossing to the kitchen that opened off the main room. He filled a glass with water from the filtered tap and brought it to me without being asked. I took it because my mouth felt like I'd been chewing chalk, and I drank half of it before I looked at him again. "I'm going to need you to tell me what happened," I said. He sat on the edge of the chair. Farther away now, I noticed like he was being deliberate about giving me space. "What do you remember?" "The Aldrich Gallery opening. My colleague's show, 8 months of sculptural work, the kind of event that gets 3 paragraphs in the Tribune, and a full spread in Chicago Magazine. I was there to support her, and to make contact with a few collectors my editor had flagged. I was a journalist, arts and culture, and events like that were technically work, even when the open bar made them feel otherwise. I remembered the champagne. I remembered the woman in red who kept laughing too loudly near the installation pieces. I remembered my ex, my ex, walking in with someone who looked like she'd been created specifically to make me feel inadequate, which was its own special category of awful. "The party," I said. "The gallery." And then, the rest of it came in pieces. Dim lighting in a different room. Music with too much bass. Someone's hand at the small of my back, guiding me through a crowd. A bar with backlit bottles. Laughing. And then nothing, I admitted. He nodded like this was the answer he'd expected. "You remember leaving the gallery?" "Vaguely. We left together," he said. "You asked to share my car. Your rideshare was 40 minutes out, and it was 20 degrees. That tracked. February in Chicago, and I'd refused to check a coat because the claim line at those events took forever." "Okay," I said. "And then?" "We came here. You had 2 more drinks, which I should have cut off sooner. We talked for approximately 3 hours. You fell asleep on my couch." He paused. "I moved you to the bed because you looked uncomfortable. I slept out here." I looked at the couch. There was a folded blanket at one end and a pillow that hadn't been there when I'd catalogued the room a moment ago. 3 hours, I repeated. You were upset, he said simply. About seeing your ex. I wasn't, I started. He just looked at me. Fine, I said. I was a little upset. That doesn't explain why I'm wearing your shirt. You spilled the second drink on yourself. You asked to change. You found that in the bathroom. I processed this. It was, I had to admit, a completely reasonable sequence of events. It also told me almost nothing about this man, who he was, why I'd felt comfortable enough to stay, why every careful detail of this apartment. The orchid, the organized kitchen visible behind him, the way my shoes were placed just so, felt like the work of someone who noticed things. I don't know your name, I said. Something moved across his expression. Amusement maybe, but the restrained kind, he said. You never asked. That's humiliating, actually. That's not like me. You were having a night, he said. I'm Beckett, he paused. Beckett Ashford. The name landed differently than I expected, not recognition exactly, more like the echo of recognition, the feeling of having heard it in a context I couldn't immediately place. Tessa, I said. Tessa Ward. I watched his face when I said it. Nothing changed. He didn't know my name either, apparently, which meant the night had been reasonably mutual in its anonymity. So, I said. Nothing happened. Nothing happened, he confirmed, with a straightforwardness that I actually found reassuring. I set the water glass down. My head was still throbbing, but the room had stopped moving, and I was beginning to feel less like I might dissolve, and more like a functional person who had made a series of questionable choices and survived them. I should go. You should eat first. He'd moved back to the kitchen while I was processing, and I noticed now that there were 2 plates on the counter, toast, eggs, scrambled, orange juice. I made enough for 2. I looked at him. He wasn't looking at me. He was plating the toast like this was just a normal Saturday morning, like feeding a stranger he'd found on his couch was something he did regularly without making it strange. I stayed for breakfast. I would think about that later, the staying, the way it felt less like a decision and more like gravity. I would think about how I'd sat on a stool at his kitchen island and eaten scrambled eggs while the lake turned silver in the morning light, and how he'd asked me what the show had been about. Really, not as small talk, but like he actually wanted to understand the work. And how I'd found myself explaining Bex's sculptural process with more enthusiasm than I'd managed to put into the piece I'd written about it. He listened the way very few people actually listen, without waiting for his turn, without formulating his response while you were still talking. It was, I told myself on the cab ride back to Wicker Park, just breakfast. It didn't mean anything. I was working late on a Thursday, 6 weeks later, when my editor flagged an article from the business section. Ashford Industries names new CEO, Beckett Ashford, 35, to lead expansion following father's retirement. There was a photo. I stared at it for a long time. You okay? My colleague Lou asked from across the shared desk. Fine, I said. Just reading. Ashford Industries. I knew the name. Everyone in Chicago did. Construction, real estate. The kind of infrastructure work that shaped what the city looked like from the ground up. Robert Ashford had been a fixture on the philanthropy circuit for 30 years. His company had a hand in half the development projects along the lakeshore, and his son, apparently, was the man who had made me scrambled eggs and listened to me talk about welded steel sculpture for 40 minutes. I had his number in my phone. He'd added it the morning I left, typed it in while I was putting on my coat, said in case you need anything with the same low-key matter-of-factness he'd applied to everything else. I had not texted it. I had thought about it more than I was comfortable admitting. I did not text it that Thursday either. I pulled up my notes file and started drafting a feature pitch about the new generation of Chicago developers and what they actually planned to do with the lakefront, and I told myself it was a coincidence. He texted me the next morning. I saw a piece in the Tribune today about the Aldrich Gallery follow-up show. Your byline. It was good. I sat with my phone in my hand for probably longer than was dignified. Thanks, I wrote back. I hear congratulations are in order. You Googled me. I saw the article. There's a difference. Is there? I was smiling at my phone like an idiot. I put it down. Pick didn't go looking. You appeared in my news feed and I was forced to confront information I hadn't sought. And what did you do with that information? I'm still deciding. He sent back a single punctuation mark. a period, which somehow managed to convey amusement and patience simultaneously. And then, let me know when you figure it out. I figured it out over the next 3 months, though figured it out is a generous description of the process. What actually happened was more like water finding a level, gradual, incremental, following the path of least resistance, without ever quite deciding to. We had dinner the week after the texts. I told myself it was because he was an interesting source. A CEO in his first 6 months, navigating a high-profile transition while his father's longtime board members watched for every misstep. Professionally relevant. Legitimately newsworthy. I did not pitch an article about him. I knew better. What I was less certain about was what exactly I was doing, because Beckett Ashford was not simple. He was thoughtful to the point of opacity sometimes, saying very little when most men would fill the silence with themselves. He had a dry humor that surfaced without warning and caught me off guard every time. He remembered things, small things, the kind that people usually don't. I mentioned once that I took my coffee with oat milk and no sugar, and he never asked again. He called me Ward when he was being playful, which was more often than his baseline seriousness would suggest. I called him Beckett, because it was what I'd known him as first, before I knew about the company and the name on half the buildings downtown, and he seemed to like that. "You treat me like a person," he said once, and the way he said it, with a kind of dry self-awareness, told me something about what the last few years of being Robert Ashford's son had been like. What I didn't know for a long time was the rest of it. My editor called me into a meeting on a Tuesday morning in May and slid a folder across the table. "This came through the tip line," she said. "Anonymous, but the documents look real." I opened it. Contracts. Purchase agreements. Signatures at the bottom of the last page that I recognized immediately, because I had seen them on expense receipts and board memos that crossed my desk during my research into the development sector. Robert Ashford's signature, and below it, Beckett's. "What am I looking at?" I asked. Potentially, a story about Ashford Industries having quietly acquired 3 parcels of Southside land in the last 18 months using a shell company, in advance of a rezoning proposal that would triple the value of that land. My editor leaned back in her chair. "If the rezoning goes through, the family makes about $40 million on a $10 million investment. The rezoning proposal, coincidentally, was introduced by a city council member whose campaign Ashford has contributed to significantly." I set the folder down. "Who sent this?" "Anonymous," like I said, routed through a secure drop. "Professional, careful, someone who knows what they're doing." She looked at me steadily. "I'm giving this to you because you've been developing sources in this sector. I need to know if you can handle it objectively." I understood what she wasn't saying. "I can handle it," I said. I walked back to my desk and sat down and looked at my phone. Beckett's last text was from Sunday. A photo of the lake at sunset, with the caption, "You'd have liked this." I had, in fact, liked it very much. I put the phone in my drawer. I pulled the folder back out, and I started working. What I found, over the next 2 weeks, was complicated. The shell company was real. The land purchases were real. The connection to the council members' campaign contributions was real and documentable and damning in the specific way that things are damning when they're technically legal, but obviously wrong. But there was something else in the documents that the anonymous tip hadn't flagged. A second set of signatures on the internal memos. Not Beckett's. A name I didn't recognize. Gerald Fitch, listed as Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions. A position that had existed at Ashford Industries for 14 years, since before Beckett had any operational role in the company, since his father was fully at the helm. I called a contact in the city clerk's office. I called an attorney who specialized in real estate law and owed me a favor. I spent 3 days in the Tribune archives reading every piece ever written about Ashford Industries, going back 20 years. And then I did what I should have done earlier and called Beckett. "I need to meet with you," I said. "Professionally. It's about your company." A pause. Not a long one, but I'd learned to read his pauses. "When?" "Today, if possible. I'll clear my afternoon." He met me in a conference room on the 32nd floor of the Ashford Industries building, and he came alone. No lawyers, no PR representative, just him across a table with a glass of water he hadn't touched. I laid out what I had. I watched his face while I did it. He went very still. "The land acquisitions," he said. Yes, through Meridian Holdings. You know the company. I know it now. His jaw tightened in a way I recognized. Not anger exactly. More like a man holding very still because movement might cost him something. I've been reviewing the book since January. There were irregularities I couldn't trace to an authorization point. Fitch left the company in February. He told my father he was retiring. Your father knew about this? The pause was longer this time. I don't know, he said, and then, quietly, I'm not sure I want to know. I looked at him across the conference table. This was the part where a source gave you the story or tried to bury it, where you found out what someone was really made of when the cost was personal. There's a version of this, I said carefully, where you cooperate with the investigation and get ahead of it, where you bring in an outside auditor, disclose everything voluntarily, and make the case that this was Fitch acting without full authorization. That version protects the company as much as possible. And the version where I don't cooperate, I print what I have. He looked at me for a long moment. I didn't flinch, even though something in my chest was doing something complicated that I didn't have time to examine. I'll retain outside counsel today, he said, and I'll authorize full disclosure to the Tribune pending legal review. He stood. I need to talk to my father. I know. He started toward the door, then stopped, turned back. This doesn't change anything, he said, between us. I need you to know that I understand why you're doing this. It might change things, I said, because I had spent 2 weeks trying not to think about that, and it seemed unfair to pretend otherwise. It might, he acknowledged, but not because you did the wrong thing. He held my gaze for another moment. I'll have my attorney call you by end of day. The story ran 4 weeks later. It was the kind of piece I'd been working toward for 3 years. Sourced, careful, significant. Robert Ashford gave a statement acknowledging the acquisitions and announcing an independent audit. Gerald Fitch was named explicitly. The council members' campaign contributions became a secondary investigation that wasn't mine to report. Beckett gave a separate statement, 11 sentences, measured and transparent, announcing that the company had proactively retained outside auditors and would cooperate fully with any investigation. My editor called it the best piece I'd written for the paper. The Tribune ran it on the front page above the fold. It got picked up nationally within 24 hours. I went home that evening and sat on my couch and felt the strange hollow sensation that came after finishing something large, when the adrenaline dropped and left you with just the quiet. My phone buzzed. It was a good piece, Ward. A pause and then another message. I mean that. I looked at the ceiling of my apartment, which was water-stained and familiar and entirely mine. How are you? I typed. Honest answer? Not great. My father isn't speaking to me. Half the board is in damage control mode. My sister called from Portland to read me headlines. A pause. But it was the right call. The audit found 3 other arrangements we didn't know about. Better now than after they compounded. I exhaled. I'm sorry about your father, I wrote. Me too. He built something real. Fitch took advantage of that. And then, can I ask you something? Sure. Did you know, when you first reached out to me, that you had the story? I stared at the question for a moment. No, I typed. I had a folder from an anonymous source and a lot of uncertainty. The story took 2 seeks of work I couldn't have predicted, and if you'd known, I would have recused myself, I wrote, or told my editor up front. I would have found a way to do my job without pretending I didn't have a conflict. The typing indicator appeared and disappeared twice before his response came. I know. That's not why I'm asking. And then, I'm asking because I've been sitting here for 3 hours trying to figure out what the next right move is, and I think it involves you, but I'm not sure I've earned the right to say that after the last month. I put the phone down, picked it up again. You were cooperative and transparent, and you did the harder thing when you had every reason not to, I typed. That's not nothing. You could have buried it, he said. If you'd wanted to protect me, you could have found a reason to call it thin, I know. You didn't? I know. That's why I trust you more now than I did before, he wrote. I realize that might be a strange thing to say. I'm saying it anyway. I sat with that for a long time. Outside my window, the city was doing its ordinary evening things. Distant traffic, someone's music through the wall, the clang of the L going past a few blocks over. Where are you? I typed. My office. I've been here since 6 this morning. Go home, Beckett. Is that a professional recommendation or a personal one? Both, I said. Go home. Eat something. Sleep. I hesitated, then added, "Call me this weekend if you want to talk." The typing indicator ran for a beat. Yeah? Yeah. He called on Sunday. We talked for 2 hours, about his father, about the company, about what he was going to do with something he'd inherited that turned out to be more complicated than he'd known, about what it meant to rebuild trust publicly when the breach had been made by someone else, but you were still holding the bag. He asked about my work, not politely, actually asked, wanted to know what I was working on next, what stories felt alive to me. We didn't see each other for another 3 weeks after that, and I won't pretend the space was comfortable. It was necessary, probably. A buffer between the professional territory we'd just navigated and wherever we went next. He texted sporadically. A link to an article he thought I'd find interesting. A photo of a terrible piece of public art he'd walked past, and wanted to share his objections with someone. Once, at 11 on a Wednesday. Do you think people are basically one thing, or do you think circumstances change who we are? I thought about that for a while before I answered. I think we're the same thing in different weather. He sent back the period again, the one that meant he was smiling. We had dinner in June, the first one that wasn't work and wasn't ambiguous. He chose a place in Lincoln Park that was good without being showy, and he was there before me when I arrived, which I'd noticed he always was, never making someone else be the one to wait. "You look different," he said when I sat down. "Different how? Less like you're deciding something." I laughed. "I think I decided." "When?" I thought about it honestly. "The conference room," I said. "When you stood up and said you'd call your attorney. I searched for the word, that was someone I wanted to know better." He was quiet for a moment. I thought you might end things after the story ran," he said. "I thought the whole situation might be too messy." "It was messy," I said. "That's not the same as wrong." "No," he agreed, "it's not." The food came. We talked about things that weren't the story, weren't the audit, weren't the complicated architecture of the last several months. He had strong opinions about the city's riverfront redevelopment that were significantly more nuanced than I'd expected from someone in his industry. I had opinions about a memoir I'd been reading that I'd been waiting for someone to argue with me about. He argued with me about it, thoughtfully with specifics, without trying to win. By the time we left, the summer evening had gone blue and warm, and we walked a few blocks without any particular destination, the city doing its best impression of somewhere you might want to stay forever. "My assistant keeps asking if we're dating," he said. "She says the answer affects her pool." "There's a pool?" "Apparently. She has $80 writing on yes." I laughed. "Tell her she wins." He stopped walking. I took 2 more steps before I realized, and turned to find him looking at me with an expression that was clearer than anything I'd seen on his face in 8 months, uncalculated, present. The careful control dropped far enough to see something real underneath. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah," I said. He crossed the 2 steps between us and kissed me, right there on a sidewalk in Lincoln Park, with a couple walking a dog who did not seem especially interested in us, and it was unhurried and certain in the way that things are certain when they've been earned. When we pulled apart, he pressed his forehead briefly against mine. "For the record," he said, "you're still the best journalist who's ever printed a story that cost me several very uncomfortable conversations with my father." "I'll put it on my resume," I said. He laughed. A real one, the rare full version that I had worked out, was reserved for moments when he wasn't managing anything at all. We walked back the way we came. The lake was somewhere in the dark beyond the buildings, the city arranging itself around us the way it always did, indifferent and enormous, and somehow, tonight, exactly the right size. I thought about the ceiling I'd woken up under in February, white and unfamiliar, and how I'd been so certain I just needed to find my shoes and go home. Some exits, it turns out, are just beginnings wearing different clothes.